Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, and welcome back to a returning guest. This is Nicholas Maxwell. I spoke with Nick way back in episode 3, and we spoke about his interactions with Popper and his interactions with Popper's philosophy and Aim-Oriented Empiricism, which was his improvement upon Popper's philosophy. And so it's great to have Nick back. Nick, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking with you again. It's a real pleasure.
It is a pleasure on my behalf. You're quite critical of Popper in a few ways, but you clearly take him very, very seriously. And Nick has a wonderful, very Popperian story, which I won't get him to repeat here. But if you go back to the old podcast, which I will link below, about his interaction at a conference with Popper. So I really do encourage listeners to go and listen to that. It's quite funny and like I said, very, very Popperian. So let's get started. We're going to talk about wisdom and what I believe has been your life's work in some ways. This has been, with 30 or 40 years, you've been applying your research.
50 years.
50 years. There you go.
At least, in a way, it goes back to my childhood, but we won't go into that.
Well, I might start with a question about that. What brings you down this particular avenue? We'll start with a few questions just to get us going here. So what did bring you down this avenue that you've been on for the last 50 years?
Of course, I always felt that, there are these two aspects to universities, that they should both be improving our knowledge and understanding of the world, and they should be helping people to live more fruitful lives. And I always had the feeling that that there was a kind of failure to adequately do the second thing. And particularly, it seemed to me that the social sciences were really disappointing in comparison. The natural sciences were had revealed, astonishing things about the nature of the universe around us. And as far as I could see, the social sciences just confirmed in very kind of ugly academic language what one already knew already. It was just as nothing as compared with the natural sciences. And so I assumed I had this sort of hunch there was something wrong with it. I suppose that was the sort of background thing. But I can remember an occasion when I was living in Gray's Inn Road in London, a rather grim road, near central London, but very convenient to where I worked, University College London. And I stepped onto a rail. I can remember the specific moment when I suddenly realized that I could tread a path that was very similar, that was an improvement over Popper's, what I saw as Popper's life's work. But what Popper had done was to put forward a new conception of scientific method, that it's not about verifying theories, it's all about falsifying theories. And then he generalized that to an idea of rationality, critical rationalism, and then used it to extraordinarily fruitful consequences in, above all, the Open Society and Its Enemies, which I still think is a great masterpiece. And which has, and showed the extraordinarily fruitful implications that critical rationalism has in all sorts of areas, and in particular, completely transforms the idea of what a rational society is, for example. Instead of a rational society employing a kind of conventional attitude of what rationality is, namely a rule-based society, which is pretty horrific, it transforms it into basically the open society. That's what the open society is. And I realized that with my improved idea, as I saw it, of scientific method, Aim-Oriented Empiricism, I could generalize that, following, in a sense, Popper's lead, to what I call aim-oriented rationality. And then that would have, all sorts of implications for the kind of, areas that Popper's critical rationalism had, which I would, then explore, uncover, and reveal. And I think that was, I'm not sure exactly when, but around 1972, I suppose, or a bit earlier. That's where it sort of where it began, and so I developed the ideas. My department was in crisis. They were trying to get rid of the department, so all teaching stopped. So I had all the time in the world to explore this new idea and all the implications of it, that I knew, all the rich implications that I knew were there, because I knew that I was, in an even better position than Popper to discover what all these implications would be, because I knew that no one had been thinking along these lines ever before. So it was a whole new territory that suddenly opened up for me to explore. And the problem became to get anything published. And at one stage, I'd sort of begun to realize that if universities were to really start fulfilling the task, their fundamental task of helping humanity to create a genuinely civilized world, rather than the chaotic and terrifying world that we live in at present, they would have to be absolutely transformed. In other words, they'd have to put what I call wisdom inquiry into practice, this new conception of the aims and methods of inquiry. I knew we needed a revolution in academia. And to begin with, I sort of went almost mad. I just never stopped talking. I thought, well, I've got to get this out. So I'd sort of talk to everyone, even strangers, I'd start talking to them. And then I can remember I was trying to write and get published the first step in it, which would become enormously important, and address it to the scientific community, Aim-Oriented Empiricism. I did publish in, Philosophy of Science along the that's where the first public published paper about Aim-Oriented Empiricism appeared in 1974, I think, after some difficulties. And I can remember writing a version. It was all written in handwriting. I could touch type. We didn't have computers in those days, long before computers. And then I would sort of realize, no, this isn't going to do it. It's not powerful enough. So I discard that manuscript and start again. And I wrote out about 17 or 18 drafts of this attempt to get across to the scientific community that the way they were thinking of science, namely in terms of what I call standard empiricism, namely that in the end, it's all evidence, which in a certain sense even Popper goes along with. In that respect, he's very orthodox. That it wasn't going to do the trick. It wasn't powerful enough to do the trick. And in the end, my parents persuaded me that I must stop and take a holiday, or I would literally go mad. So I did. I went off to Edinburgh to stay with a friend for a bit. And then years later, I found these documents on my desk, and I was really impressed. I thought, well, they're all very good, but I realized what I was misunderstanding was that however powerful an argument I might produce, I was up against an institution, namely science as it is. And however powerful the argument was, it wasn't going to, it was hopeless to think that a mere argument was going to transform the institution, in particular when the institution was designed to take my to ensure that my argument never entered in, because in order to be a contribution to science, it ought to at least be a testable idea. And of course, that wasn't my argument. My valid argument was not a testable idea. It was the argument that we shouldn't be imposing this constraint upon science. We should include some discussion about the aims of science, in particular the highly problematic aims. And science at present has misunderstood its aims. That's what we probably talked about a bit last time.
You mentioned
so that's
wisdom.
how it all began.
Mm.
And then the first real exposition came with my first book, What's Wrong with Science? Towards, I'm quoting from memory, it was a few years ago, it was published in 1976, towards a people's rational science of delight and compassion, the subtitle. And a friend had a friend who had a printing press for a bit in his front room of his house. And he said he would publish a book if I could get the manuscript to him in 6 weeks. So I had 6 weeks. So I thought about what it was going to be and how it was going to be structured. And by the time I'd sort of decided how it was going to be, there were 3 weeks to get the book written. So I wrote my first book in 3 weeks. And it took the form of most of it with a fierce dialogue between an orthodox scientist defending his view of science and academia in general, and someone who was who I finally decided would have to be called a philosopher, who was essentially me expounding my ideas. And the whole idea of it was, in Plato, Socrates produces ridiculous arguments, and the person he's discussing says, "Oh, how correct Socrates! Oh, how wise! Yes," and agrees with everything Socrates says. Well, my experience of argument is that no one ever agrees with anyone. Almost no one. I mean, rarely do you actually persuade people they're wrong, although they may think about it afterwards. So the whole book is constructed like that. No one convinces anyone of anything, but the arguments are all there, furiously sometimes engaged in grumpily and so on. And that was published. And I thought I'd done it. I've got my message out, my great message that we have to transform universities all over the world in order to help transform the world for the better. And it got 3 reviews in pretty minor places. One review in New Scientist by Jay Ravitz, but unfortunately he said this book has too many jokes in it and one shouldn't have jokes in philosophy. He meant it as a joke, but I'm sure it warned people away. And then a friend of mine who I never met, called David Horrobin, who was a dedicated follower of Popper, who edited a journal called Medical Hypotheses, which I think still exists, persuaded me that what I needed to do was write sort of my version of the logic of scientific discovery, a fully fledged academic book that spelled out my basic argument. And I thought, he said, not many people will read it, but everyone will know it's there, and it will serve the function that's needed to persuade people that we need to take the idea seriously. So over a period of about 3 years, and with immense care, I wrote my next book, From Knowledge to Wisdom, which spells the whole argument out. And I remember thinking, I'm saying something that essentially no one has ever said before. How is it that nevertheless, amazingly, that the English language is adaptive enough to be able to communicate this, something that it was never intended to do, and that was published, and It was very widely reviewed, and it was very, very successful and went into 2 paperbacks. And then Blackwell's, who published it, fell on hard times, and it fell out of print. And I've been trying to keep the idea. I've been, then ever since I've been trying to keep the idea alive, as it were, or rather to reanimate it, so that it at least becomes sort of available as a possibility that perhaps there is something fundamentally wrong with universities as they've been constituted for the century or so. When judged from the point of view of helping to promote human welfare, or even more fundamentally, helping humanity to create a more civilized, a genuinely good world, in which wars are unthinkable and democracy prevails everywhere, and there is something like a global, democratic, global government.
The title of that book, that second one, I read it in preparation for the first podcast. And first, I must say, I was smiling a little bit when you were saying you were having troubles thinking about how to start publishing, because you now have a bucket load of books. There, I would hate to count, but there literally is a whole shelf there.
I think there are 15.
Yeah, so I will link below for people to go and have a look, as well as a uncountable amount of academic articles which I'll link there. But the title of that book was From Knowledge to Wisdom, and I think a good way to get into this would be to ask what you mean by those 2 words, because I think many people listening would equate wisdom simply with knowledge, or the other way around, whichever way you want to look at it. And you have a distinction, and I think when we get into what that distinction is, we'll see what your thesis is, or at least we'll begin to open up what your thesis is.
Well, of course, what I'm arguing for is a transformation of the aims and methods of academic inquiry. So there is a new aim, or a modified aim, and modified methods, and it means that almost everything changes. I mean, some things change much more radically than other things if my ideas are going to be put into practice. And of course, you don't have to do it overnight. You can do it bit by bit. I mean, that of course would happen if it ever gets seriously undertaken. And of course, some glimmerings of what I've been arguing for have begun to happen here and there. Well, knowledge, I don't think I mean any. I have a sort of Aim-Oriented Empiricism. Should I say something about what Aim-Oriented Empiricism is?
Yeah, please jump. I mean,
just to indicate how I differ from Karl Popper.
Yeah, at some point it's definitely going to come up. So,
So as far as science is concerned, and this is where the argument, in a sense, begins, where Popper goes wrong is about something absolutely fundamental, namely the basic aim of science. In particular, let's take the fundamental science, which is what Popper does, really. When he talked about science, he's really talking about physics, or even sort of theoretical physics. It's simply wrong to say that the basic aim is truth. And the basic method is to assess conjectures about the truth with respect to empirical considerations, because there are always an infinity of theories that we can concoct which are compatible with all the evidence we ever had. And actually, one can easily concoct theories that are even more fit the facts, available facts, even better than wonderful theories in physics that we have. The best theories, sort of Newton, quantum theory, whatever you can think of, as long as those are the only considerations. But in reality, there are 2 considerations that are absolutely crucial, equally crucial. First of all, of course, predicting phenomena. But secondly, a theory, in order even to be a candidate for consideration, it has to have this feature of unity. You can't have a theory that says one set of laws over here, another laws over here, and another laws over here. You can't have a kind of patchwork quilt theory. You've got to have a theory. Think of Newton's theory. The same law of gravitation applies to all objects that are attracting each other by gravitation. You don't have different laws for different size masses and so on. So unity is essentially, well, in order to, one way of putting it is to say, don't concentrate on the problem of unity, concentrate initially on what disunity means. And what disunity means is that you have a theory that applies to a vast range of phenomena, as physical theories do, and you can divide the phenomena, the possible phenomena to which it applies, to a number of different groups, and in each group, throughout the phenomena, the same law applies, but is different from all the others. So there are n of these different subspaces of the space of all phenomena, and if there are n of them, then the degree of disunity is n. And for unity, you need n equals 1. So it's actually a quite simple problem to solve, but a crucial problem to solve, to be absolutely clear what this criterion of unity is, a problem which even baffled Einstein, incidentally, although he did say, I can't solve it immediately, but he indicated he was sure it was solvable. He called it inner perfection. And you could argue it goes a little bit further than that, but basically that's the basic idea. Philosophers of science are still struggling with this problem, even though I solved it ages ago, but as usual got completely ignored. But it's a crucial problem to solve in order to understand the philosophy of physics, and indeed physics itself, of course, because it's one of the two main, the two criterion for accepting a theory. Sufficiently good at predicting phenomena and sufficiently unified. And if you look at the history of physics, you see, that unity has played a crucial part. But the point is that in employing this requirement of unity, we are simply ignoring, that is, if you like, rejecting infinitely many theories that can be, ridiculous theories, like in the year 2050, gravitation is going to suddenly become repulsive instead of attractive or something. And there are endlessly many other ridiculously disunified theories that you can concoct, not just disunified in space and time, but in other dimensions of variation as well, like variations of mass or substance and so on, which doubtless, which have never so far been refuted because no one thought to do the experiments to refute them. And even if they did, they wouldn't do it because it's so obvious that they're false. So this requirement of unity is absolutely crucial. But what it means is that in rejecting disunified theories persistently, even though they're even more empirically successful than the theories we accept, we're making a big implicit assumption about the nature of the universe, that it has some kind of underlying unity. But this is a pure metaphysical conjecture, untestable, exactly what Popper excludes from science. The whole enterprise of physics, and therefore the whole enterprise of the natural sciences, makes this massive, highly problematic assumption. How do we know the universe is unified? Even if it is, how do we know it's unified in the way that we're implicitly assuming it is at the present moment? And if you look at the history of physics, you see we've been changing our ideas ever since, in Descartes' time, they thought it was all made up of little corpuscles. Now we think it's superstrings. Well, we've sort of more or less abandoned that idea, perhaps. So what we need to do is to do physics a little bit more honestly and acknowledge, and rationally, and acknowledge this big assumption, this metaphysical assumption, as an integral part of our conjectural knowledge in physics, and make it explicit, formulate it in terms of a hierarchy of assumptions that become less and less substantial as you go up the hierarchy, and create a kind of framework in which at the top we have assumptions that are so minimal and so, if anything there got modified, then probably life will become impossible. And then as we go down the hierarchy, the assumptions get more substantial and more likely to be wrong, until we get to the lowest metaphysical assumption, which is almost bound to be wrong and has been modified many times in the history of physics. And so we create a framework for constraining the assumptions that are worth thinking about seriously as a part of doing physics. And this provides us, it makes absolutely clear, it fits what goes on in physics. It also provides a rational method of discovery, because it's through thinking about the possible candidates for new theories, the metaphysical ideas, which, if made more precise, might become a testable theory, a good testable theory, because it will be unified, that we can develop new theories. And that's exactly the sort of way in which Einstein developed special and general relativity. The most striking example of employing something very close to aim-oriented rationality. And towards the end of his life, Einstein almost articulated this view. When I first read Einstein after I'd had the idea, I thought, oh dear, it's not original. Einstein had thought it all up beforehand. But he didn't quite get there, but very close. Well, I've been trying to get that through to the scientific community, because that seems an important first step. But can I go on? Is that all right?
Yeah, yeah, please. Yeah. I was just going to ask, just as you were doing that, as you were talking, I'm staring up at your diagram there with the and I will link it below as well for people to look at. A couple of quick questions on that, because I think it will help us when we're getting into wisdom a little later on.
Do interrupt, by the way, for God's sake, let me speak. That's I shall just maintain this unspeakable flow.
I'm fully aware that in your books and your articles, you do the great philosophical thing of putting a lot of criticism, answering a lot of criticism at the back. So a few of the things I might bring up here, you may have already answered, probably all of them. But the first one that comes to mind as you speak in that way is, if you create this hierarchy of metaphysics, of empirical data, and what we should challenge and what we should not, or at least what is more acceptable and what is less acceptable, does it not, in your view, discourage boldness? Encouraging people to attack things on those lower levels and not look to grand, bold theories in science and philosophy?
Well, I think we should certainly not say that someone is really stepping way outside the whole framework of science as it's been pursued since Kepler and Galileo. Of course, what I'm arguing for is continuing in the spirit of a developed version of what both Kepler and Galileo did. They both held this view that natural phenomena are governed by precise laws, and so the only theories worth considering are the theories that specify those kinds of laws. What's the man who has, I've forgotten his name now. I mean, you do hear of cranky ideas that don't fit in with this idea at all, and they're sort of spat out of science. Scientists tried. There's a man, afraid I've forgotten his name, but he has this idea that is called resonating, has to do with when some new substance comes into existence for the first time, it makes it easier in the future for this substance to be formed. So there's a kind of resonance through time. And this affects things like disease or... now, I think this is sort of completely crazy from my point of view. Even if it would require, if that is true, it would require not just a revision of a few theories in science, it would require an absolutely fundamental change of the whole enterprise of science, the whole way we look at the universe, that things go on. It would be like discovering that ghosts really happen, or even ghosts that, can move objects around, would completely transform. It would mean that physicalism, that from the point of view of doing physics, physicalism is a part of our scientific knowledge, that everything is made up of ultimately of one kind of entity, a sort of field-like entity that varies with time and with space, and everything exists is an outcome of that. That's a sort of basic part of our current knowledge, that our best scientific theory, metaphysical theory of the nature of the physical universe, although there's more to what there is, in my view, than just physics. Well, to overthrow that, and if any hope of really getting that taken seriously, what you would have to do would be to develop a new metaphysical idea which shows some real signs of leading to even greater empirical progress than the progress that science as it is achieving. Well, that's an immense thing to do. It's not just a question of there seems to be some evidence in favor of this theory. It's a question of developing the whole research program of natural science, the new research program with new metaphysics and new methods has to be created and then be shown to be showing signs, some real signs of greater success than what we have at present. Now that's the realistic task that lies before getting this idea taken seriously. It hasn't even remotely begun to do that. So, of course, the scientific community.
Do you think that maybe scientists are doing some of this anyway? If aim-oriented empiricism is such a successful pathway, do you think many scientists over the years have stumbled upon it, without really knowing what they've stumbled upon and simply acting upon it? Popper always said that even if scientists weren't critical rationalists, they were doing critical rationalism in the lab. So do you think that people have stumbled upon this just by happenstance and are making improvements in this way?
Actual science is a very weird mixture. It's spelled out in most detail in is Science Neurotic, where I really spell out this weird feature of science that it's got its basic aim wrong. What I was thinking about where the appeal to neurosis comes in, which is briefly stated From Knowledge to Wisdom, that where you misconstrue what your aim is. You think you have the Oedipus complex. You think you love your mother, so you hate your father, so you want to kill him, but you don't want to kill him because you love him, and so you misconstrue your aim. That you really love him, but you actually, somewhere deep down, you want to kill him because he's a rival to your mum. That's the sort of Oedipus complex, as Freud, I think, sort of understood it. Well, this is Freud. Psychoanalytic theory, all social sciences, should be reinterpreted not as sciences, but as methodologies, and the methodology of pursuing the aims of life and the institutions and so on. And Freudian and psychoanalytic theory is a special case of that. And what would be good if that happened would be that it then becomes applicable to institutions as well as people, because institutions have aims and methods, and it applies to science. And my argument is that science suffers from what I call rationalistic neurosis, namely it's got its basic aim wrong. It's not truth. It's truth presupposed to be unified, or if you like, explanatory truth, highly problematic, and so it really needs serious attention as science proceeds. And so there is what it's really doing, which is obscured by this orthodox view, which I call standard empiricism. The aim is truth, and the method is assessing theories with respect to evidence. So scientists, fortunately, or good scientists, in their work sort of kind of violate the norms of standard empiricism, but standard empiricism is nevertheless influential in all sorts of ways and obscures what's really going on. Incidentally, Einstein, in effect, made the key point that he said at one point in one of his occasional writings: if you want to know what the methods of physics are, don't ask the physicists, look at what they do.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, what Einstein was making the key point, that what scientists say they're doing is rather different from what they're actually doing, and he was well aware of that. So what I was talking about was what I took you to be saying. So all scientists, of course, are doing something that approaches Aim-Oriented Empiricism, but they're doing it badly, because what standard empiricism does is says, if an idea is going to be a serious part of science, and certainly a part of scientific knowledge, it has to be testable, and it has to be corroborated, to use Popper's term. And that simply doesn't fit what actually goes on in science. So there is this big discrepancy between what actually goes on and what scientists sort of manage to convince themselves goes on, and the official idea of what should be going on.
Do you make use of the
taught? It's just implicit in everything. Scientists are kind of brainwashed. If you really want to brainwash something, don't teach it. Just teach a whole lot of stuff that is imbued with this idea. So they never encountered it. It's just everywhere in all the papers they read, etc., etc., etc. But what I was talking about is what I took you to mean is, what about those few mavericks who do something that is based on a metaphysical idea which clashes with, at some level, with the hierarchy of some level of the hierarchy of metaphysical assumptions about science.
In a way, yeah, and those mavericks would succeed.
Yes. Well, if Aim-Oriented Empiricism would have the consequence that such work would be very much discouraged, because if you really understood the Aim-Oriented Empiricism, you would say, well, there's really no hope, because the current metaphysics of science has proved to be so astonishingly successful. And you'll also be aware of what you'd have to do in order to get anywhere. You'd have to create a whole new science. You wouldn't just be tinkering at the edges with a new theory about some specific range of phenomena. You'd be creating a whole new scientific enterprise, and that's a monumental affair. You'd have to have an even bigger wholesale revolution in science of anything that Kuhn talked about in the structure of scientific revolutions. But I think in sort of sociological terms, or institutional terms, or whatever you like to call it, a little bit of one of few people doing that kind of work shouldn't be totally discouraged, because it may, keep alive thinking about these issues. But of course, if Aim-Oriented Empiricism were being put into practice, then it encourages criticism. It makes explicit things that need to be encouraged. The basic idea is to get people criticizing what really does need to be criticized for the success of science itself, which is at present being, you can't really criticize things that are assumptions that you're making, that you're completely unaware that they are the assumptions you're making. So Aim-Oriented Empiricism is, the whole idea is to facilitate fruitful criticism of what really does need to be criticized for the progress of science. And of course, that's the very first step, because it isn't just that the aim of truth is wrong or inadequate, because we need to take the basic aim to be explanatory truth or unified truth. But furthermore, actually what goes on in science is that what we want is a generalization of that, namely valuable truth that is of value intrinsically, because it's helps us to improve our understanding or is wonderful or amazing in all sorts of ways, and truth that is in all sorts of ways useful, really of value for life. And that, if anything, is even more problematic, of value for whom and when and how, and things that may seem to be of value may turn out to be horribly disvalued, the very opposite. So science, in order to be rational, needs to have sustained exploration, not just of metaphysical assumptions, but of value assumptions that are there already, of course, because, if a result is utterly trivial, it doesn't get published. So values play a massive role in what it becomes scientific knowledge, or just what gets published and what doesn't get published. But officially, the sort of orthodox view is that values don't have anything to do with decisions about what actually goes on in the intellectual domain of science. They may go on in things like grant giving bodies and so on, but actually values are not just inevitably a part of the scientific enterprise, but so they bloody well ought to be a part of the enterprise, because what we want is knowledge that is really interesting or really useful, and not that we don't want stuff that is going to have all sorts of damaging consequences.
Is it not valuable enough simply to be true? I mean, this is going to walk us into wisdom and what the separation is. Well,
then there's a third generalization, and that is that science doesn't, in practice, just discover intrinsically valuable or useful truth, and so that needs sustained critical discussion and assessment. And we need these three domains. At present, there is very crudely two domains of discussion in science. At the level of experiment and observation, evidence, and the level of theory, we need to recognize a crucial third domain of discussion, aims. And there need to be journals devoted to aims. And of course, and then the final generalization of science, the generalization concerning aims of science, is that, of course, what gets discovered and published and accepted, then in many cases, in every case actually, in my view, needs to be made available to people, to the public, and in the appropriate places, and to promote human value. And that's even more problematic because, of course, discoveries in science can be used in all sorts of ways for all sorts of reasons. What science and technology does is to, from the point of view of applications, is enormously increase our power to act, or for some of us, our powers to act. And that may mean, all sorts of good things, but it also may mean things like weapons and horrific things. And even the good things have had all sorts of damaging consequences. There is vast improvements in medicine and hygiene and agriculture and methods of travel, and all the glories of the modern world. And of course, all this is also responsible for the absolute disaster that we face at the moment, namely global warming, the climate crisis, in other words, and the crisis of which is sometimes called the ecological crisis, of the catastrophic loss of wildlife, the destruction of natural habitats, tropical rainforests, places where creatures can live, and the impending mass extinction of species. We have inherited from the past this amazing natural world all around us, and we're going to leave to our children and grandchildren an unspeakably impoverished natural world as a result of our lunatic application of modern science and technology. So science, or if you like more broadly, the academic enterprise, as it has been practiced, has had a is deeply implicated. It has made possible the devastating crises that we face. And of course, there are other obvious ones, like the possibility of nuclear annihilation, and things like, for example, what's going on in Ukraine. And not only is the academic enterprise implicated in the creation of these problems, and of course, Britain, my country, is deeply implicated because it started the whole thing off with the Industrial Revolution, made possible by the earlier scientific revolution. We wouldn't have had an Industrial Revolution if it wasn't for the earlier scientific revolution. But also the academic enterprise, based on the idea that the proper way to proceed is, if you want to help promote human welfare, is to first develop knowledge and technological know-how, and then apply it to help solve social problems. That prescription, which basically informs a massive amount of what goes on in universities, is fundamentally flawed. It's deeply irrational. That if just from a simple Popperian point of view, if you have a problem to solve, then the first two things that you need to do, not just Popper, but any sane person would hold this, you need to try and get as clear as possible about what the problem is, and then put forward and critically assess possible solutions. Now, if you're trying to promote human welfare, then the fundamental thing to do is to get clear about what the problems are, and then try and develop good ideas about how to solve them, which of course are fundamentally actions, things that we do, policy, government programs, etc., how we live. Of course, we may also need science and technology, but that's a kind of secondary matter. And many problems don't need, it's completely irrelevant to have new science and technology. We have all of that that we need. The essential thing is to find new ways of acting, new ways to live together with each other.
Do you imagine
each other? Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, this gets us into the heart of it, I think, here. Do you imagine that those problems are genuinely avoidable? Of course, there's that Popperian line about, you solve a problem and it just produces new problems, different problems, but better problems. And when you talk about climate change, I think almost everyone will be with you on saying it is a significant problem, just like all the other things that you listed there and many other things you list in your articles. But were they foreseeable problems in a way? I got a slight implication from what you're saying that these things were avoidable in some way if we just had the right values at the beginning. But if you get the right values at the beginning, they're only going to be the right values for today, and tomorrow they may turn out to be poor.
Well, picking up on the first point you made, this is why it needs serious thinking about, so that, it's not the way to really solve our problems is not to do the first thing that occurs to us, but to think as carefully as we can about consequences of action. Now, that's what I included in put forward conjectures and examine them critically. That is, think through all the possible consequences very carefully, imagine all sorts of scenarios, possible outcomes. I mean, this does go on. The civil service, I'm sure, are engaged in these things all the time, to the outrage of the politicians. That's absolutely essential, of course, and that needs to go on socially. It's not just governments need to do this.
But surely there'll always be some things that we can't predict, right? Some implications.
Of course, we'll get it wrong. Yes, I mean, but that isn't any reason for not proceeding, intelligently, rationally, and trying to do the best we can. And one of the, I say this very clearly from knowledge to wisdom at one point, and it's sort of a theme that runs through the book. That while we're putting what my whole message is about, we've got these two absolutely fundamental problems. The problem of improving our knowledge and understanding of the world around us, the universe, and improving our understanding of ourselves and other living things as a part of the universe, and the problem of creating a genuinely civilized world. And that problem has been, in a sense, created by this extraordinary transition from hunting and gathering societies, where we were created through hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, because it was a way of life. It's not so very different from the way that pre-humans lived and chimpanzees lived in the wild. From day to day, small groups of people, roughly 150 in size. And there's a wonderful book that I talk about in my first book, What's Wrong with Science. It begins with an account of the pygmies of Central Africa, the rainforests of Central Africa, by Colin Turnbull, called The Forest People, where at one point he says, what is so characteristic about pygmy life is everything happens cooperatively without any organization. And what is so clear about the book is that this happens sort of willy-nilly, because everyone lives cheek by jowl. They know, no more than 150 people. So everyone automatically knows everyone else. And crime is simply not really possible because of the way people live. And he gives a wonderful account of someone who steals something and he's banished from the community, and he thinks, God, what a disaster. They can't possibly live in the forest all by themselves. And then he noticed that evening that the young man has reappeared very quietly, and everyone has sort of forgotten about it, apparently. And it's sort of and it absolutely works. He's never going to do it again. You realize how stupid it is. And that's the kind of world we really need, where we have institutions and social arrangements which encourage cooperative rationality. That is, where people who are involved in some enterprise and affected by some enterprise, some institution or business or so on, can share responsibility in a practical way. So not everyone all the time involved in all decision making or anything ridiculous like that. And so the big transition is sort of as I see it, is sort of a version of the Popper's transition from the closed to the open society. But of course, the real transition is very different from the way Popper describes it in The Open Society and Its Enemies. It's really from something like the hunting and gathering tribe, which is utterly different from the closed society, and in some ways so much better than our society, because crime and rape and things like that, and certainly the pygmy society, I think not every small group is quite as good as that, but it's certainly possible and must have existed for thousands and thousands of years. In many ways, in all sorts of ways, has willy-nilly solved political problems. And we're still struggling with the problems we've created as the transitions we've made as a result of moving from that kind of society to an agricultural society, to big towns and big cities, and the modern world, where the whole world can be annihilated with a finger touching a button, more or less.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. That word coordinate, or I think it was cooperate that you used, that has, in some of the criticism I read, set off a number of philosophers. And I think scientists. I think Anthony O'Hare was on this. He's been on the podcast as well once before. And I think he was set off by these people. But Anthony O'Hare.
Yeah.
And I think, O'Hare. And that line, cooperation, I suspect it sets off a number of alarm bells within people. It sounds like you taken away some of the individualism or the personal aspect of this. Why not just leave scientists alone with their own theories? And don't we really, if you want science and you want knowledge to move forward in a way, or even the discovery of the best values for which wisdom should be, don't you want the toughest competition between ideas? I know you have answers for this, but I'm just consciously reading through your work. It seems that particular word, cooperation, set off a number of alarm bells in a few people.
I did have a long talk about with Anthony O'Hare about his critique that he put in his book, and he did end up by apologizing for so awfully misrepresenting what From Knowledge to Wisdom is about. People sort of just foist on to me conventional interpretations of things, which I've made very explicitly, is not the way I'm talking about. I mean, as I use, and I make this clear, as I use cooperation, competition is not in conflict with cooperation. I mean, the scientists massively cooperate, and a part of it is setting up, competition. Competition without cooperation could mean getting machine guns and shooting, killing the people you're engaged in. Absolutely. The idea is absurd, of course. And actually, at present, competition, because what counts as a contribution to science, in some aspects, is harmful to science. There are lots of stories that scientists I've read about scientists who keep very quiet about the research they're doing, because they know that if they were to say, well, this is what we're attempting to do, a very well-funded group in America would seize on it and get it published long before this poor little group in Scotland somewhere with minimal funds are struggling to develop the idea. And indeed, from the point of view of science, it would be very good if that happened, because it would be just got developed much quicker. So, but if we had Aim-Oriented Empiricism, to publish an idea for research in the domain of aims, in the journal for aims, would get you credit. Certainly if it leads to good results, then you will be known as, might even get a Nobel Prize for it. So you'll be making a contribution to science if you come up with a good idea that someone else seizes upon and does the work that leads to whatever, is the result, as a result at present will be conceived. But because that isn't the way science proceeds, competition can actually have a stifling effect on scientific progress in precisely that way, and has done, and does do. Scientists try to keep to themselves. And we, read the discovery in DNA. There's quite a lot about that. They were terrified they were going to be scooped. What does resisting being scooped means? Delaying discovery of science. And Aim-Oriented Empiricism will make that disappear. In all sorts of ways, it promotes science, and yet science is at this level, things are so dogmatic that after 50 years, I've even failed to get this tiny little minimal point across, that the whole way in which scientists themselves conceive of science is damaging to science. Not only is it invalid, and obviously invalid, and all I need to do is to get hold of someone and talk it through, and they recognize quite soon that, yes, of course, standard empiricism is completely untenable, because the argument, which I spelled out earlier, is extremely simple and unanswerable. And yet, because the existing view excludes everything that isn't testable officially, even just that makes it very difficult. And actually, because of increasing specialization over the years, it makes it even more difficult. I have actually published some things in Nature years ago on these issues and in physics journals. But that was a long time ago. Now, when I try to get such things published in scientific journals, it just gets absolutely dismissed as utterly irrelevant to what today's science is about. So it's actually got worse.
As you say that, I was scrounging through some paper in front of me, and I found a criticism just along those lines there. This is from Noreta Cortege. I'm pronouncing that last name incorrectly.
Yes, yes.
And she says, and again, just that she's convinced, but this is, and I did bump into this a couple of other times as well. She says, this is her quote: "For me, the weakest part," so she goes on and she begins to explain how she found it all very convincing about the problem of theory selection and the breakdown within epistemology. And she goes on to say, this is the quote: "For me, the weakest part of his philosophy, Maxwell's philosophy of wisdom, was its tacit political theory, to base science policy on empathy and consensus, no matter how rationally arrived at, might indeed make science the servant of the people." So that criticism did come up a number of times there. This idea that if you begin with values, you are going to take away something very important about science.
I didn't quite get the argument. Can you, because I was thinking, I started to think about, I hadn't really answered your previous questions about Antonio here. The point is that I do discuss that issue in connection, in particular, the possibility that somehow clashes with Popper's ideas about the rational society. And what I point out is that how appallingly inadequate Popper's reasons are for thinking that putting forward ideas about possible futures are. That the problem is really sort of because we live in a complicated, big complicated society. It would be so much easier when it's the changes we've introduced as a result of moving from, small tribal societies to big existing societies, but not impossible. And I very carefully spell out why the kind of cooperative rationality that I'm talking about, and I'm referring, of course, to aim-oriented rationality, enhances individual liberty, because it absolutely fun. If it was really to be implicated, if it was really to be put into practice, then one will be able, what it involves is taking into account the different aims, ideas that different people have, and trying to discover the best resolution of what these may be. So it enhances individual liberty rather than, it makes more individual liberty possible, because one of the things that damages individual liberty is some individuals that have lots of means to realize their aims, intruding on the lives of others in horrible ways, whether they like it or not, because they can just ignore it. I mean, that goes on all the time with very wealthy people who, in effect, do all sorts of damaging things to others. So cooperation is not, it doesn't involve, ideally, of course, it doesn't involve coercion. Of course, there has to be coercion at some point. Horrible things, we have to have means to stop horrible things from happening. But the idea is that we may gradually move towards a world where things that seem to be endemic, intrinsic to human life, are sort of unthinkable. Until, we more or less thought that war in Europe, which would seem to be, if you look at it historically, just an inherent part of life. Every now and again, some 2, 3, 4 countries have a good old war, and that's been going on for ages and ages, forever, right back in the whole of history, has become unthinkable because of the EU. It is possible to change things so fundamentally that something has been endemic for 2,000 years or so is now unthinkable. We need to do that for the whole globe. We need to start thinking about things that people tend not to think about. And then doing things that we tend to do nothing about.
So
Why don't the democracies of the world get together and be serious about the fact that over nearly half the population of the world lives in not just undemocratic nations, but sort of dictatorial nations? Horrific.
I think the answer, well, an answer to that might be a challenge to at least some of the coordination issue you're talking about there, which why don't the democracies of the world get together and solve significant problems in the world which seem obvious to us? It may simply be that it's not obvious to all the democracies in the world that those problems are significant. And for ones which clearly are, like invasion of Ukraine or global poverty, it may not be obvious to the democracies that they are the ones who are best to solve it. It may be best solved, and this is again something that's going to trigger a memory of some of the criticism you have in your book, which is why won't we just do a Popperian piecemeal social engineering project here? Why does what you are imagining sounds very grand?
Just piecemeal. Well, we haven't got on to that. We haven't got on to Aim. I've only just mentioned it, but piecemeal social engineering is hopelessly inadequate. And the reasons for it is not lack of knowledge in social science, because the whole of social science is profoundly inadequate. Something that, it shouldn't be science at all, or even the pursuit of knowledge fundamentally. It should be, all of social inquiry should be fundamentally concerned to help promote more rational problem solving in the real world. That's the proper task that's just an aspect of wisdom inquiry. We need, of course, a whole range of things, from thinking about short-term problems to thinking about long-term problems. We need to think of the implications of what we're doing now. And I mean, a classic case, after all, is, well, you could say global warming is about the natural world, but it's also about us. The most unpredictable thing climate scientists have been saying ever since they knew it was going to happen in the early 1960s. So some models were put forward, and the biggest unknown was what were people going to do about it? Because of course we could have solved the problem ages ago, in the 60s. And in my view, if what I advocated in 1984 had been taken up seriously in the 80s, we wouldn't have the problem now. We could have easily dealt with it. We've got plenty of decades to do it, and we've just wasted it, essentially. All that time, we could done the thing in a sensible, steady way, and there would have been all sorts of political issues. It's a global issue, so there would be all sorts of global issues about what to do about countries that are not doing anything, like Iran, because China was always aware of the problem and took it very seriously, even though it's now pumps out more greenhouse gases than any other country, but it's also doing more than any other country. So it's a very mixed picture. And as for Putin, it was pretty clear to me from the outset that Putin was an absolute disaster for the future of Russia. There was evidence, which may not be conclusive, that he was responsible for bombing two flats in the outskirts of Moscow, I think, right near the beginning of his time, in order to blame it on the Chechens and initiate the Chechen War, his first war. Well, someone who does that is clearly an absolute monster. There was evidence right from the word go. What does Tony Blair do? He rushes off the moment Putin gets into power and throws his arm around him and welcomes him into the world of democratic nations, as it were. And subsequently, right-wing American economists went in and gave ridiculous advice that sabotaged, in effect, Russia's brief hope of moving towards real democracy.
So just like with
The whole thing is
science.
just, and when you think about it towards China, it just flip flops. There's no long-term policy. We need a long-term policy. This is not sort of thinking you must only think about immediate problems is kind of crazy. Of course, there is a sense in which the present structure of China may be overthrown in a month's time. We don't know, but we certainly should take very seriously the possibility that this isn't going to happen and that this is going to persist. And we should have a long-term policy about what we should do about it, how we can best encourage China to move towards a more democratic state of affairs, which seems a long way from what exists at present. And not just flip-flop from saying we welcome China, even if it is rather different from us, we must fight them, or we're going to have a war with them before too long, which is absolutely, this flip-flop thing from going bad and doing one thing to the other is completely idiotic. Of course, it's governed by democratic politics. The tendency is to think about the next general election or the next presidential election. And that's why we need universities to be contributing persistently good ideas and keeping them alive and promoting them in society and getting them discussed and getting public debate and discussion going about issues that are simply not being talked about. Absolutely fundamental obligation and duty of universities, and totally failing because they simply don't think that their job is to do that kind of thing, and it doesn't go on. As I say in my list of, I think, 23 structural changes that need to be made as a kind of bare minimum to move from what we have at present, a disastrously irrational, intellectually appalling state of affairs, judged from both the standpoint of the pursuit of knowledge and the standpoint from the point of view of promoting human welfare, and certainly from the point of view of helping humanity move towards a better kind of world. We need to give absolute priority to promoting good thinking about how to solve our long-term problems, global problems, as well, of course, as how to solve local problems, immediate problems. And the thing is to get thinking going and get good thinking going, and get Popperian, elements of Popperian, but certainly just the simple matter of exploring possibilities and looking at them critically and anticipating disastrous possible outcomes and imagining scenarios and all that kind of thing as an integral part of life. So it becomes integral to life. I mean, all that is actually very graphically expounded in my first little book, published written in 3 weeks, that everyone's forgotten about.
Apparently. It is still there. It is still available. I'm not sure if it's
So back to Merita. Tell me what you.
I think you actually answered it in that answer there. But as you were speaking there, I began to get a clear idea of the emphasis you're looking for here. And when you're criticizing piecemeal social engineering, one of the other criticisms that kept coming up, people were a bit of tongue-in-cheek calling you a utopian social engineer. And as you were talking there about China, how it'd be good to have a policy, or at least a long-term thought-out policy about what to do about a country like China. A lot of the criticisms were along the line of, and this is me paraphrasing here, even with a long-term policy towards China, that it is overreaching to think that we can affect people in such a different society, or it is not quite the moral thing to do to want to change it for them. They'll have to make their own decisions, even if those decisions are right. And I'll get you to answer that, but my inclination there from your last answer is that you're saying that all could be true, but the problem is we just haven't been putting enough time and energy or thought into these things. There's just not enough attention at all into what the policy should be. We've been on autopilot, so to speak.
Yes, we sort of leave it to the politicians, and they sort of flip-flop from taking one extreme. They're our friends, they're making lots of the things that we need very cheaply, so it's all great, to, my God, they're actually surveillancing our life. We've invited them to help in Britain, in my country. We've invited them a few years ago to build a nuclear power station, but supposing they put things in that at a touch of a button in China will blow it up, or you know, putting us under surveillance. The police have China-made cameras all over our streets. How do we know the Chinese are not looking at everything we're doing and getting all sorts of bad information? So at one moment we think they're great, and the next moment we think we're the enemy. It's just a sort of idiotic flip-flop from one attitude to another attitude, which is utterly stupid. And what we need is sustained thinking about what is the best approach that will give the best hope of encouraging, for example, those in China who are working away to trying to get things more democratic, and you know the tiny things they do result in them being put into prison. There are such things. So what is the? It may make very little difference, but we certainly ought to be thinking about these things. And in some other places, it may make a big difference what our attitudes to be. We need to develop and get what seemed to be a good, the best policy likely to be fruitful, even if it isn't of much help at all. We need to get going the idea amongst the democracies of the world, made available to people who live in societies that don't have democracies, or have flawed democracies, like America, for example, and I would say our country as well, because you know when we vote, most of us go for a ritual that has no impact on the result whatsoever, because it's only marginal voters who are a minority of people who have any impact ordinarily. So what kind of voting system is that? Pretty gruesome. I've never had a real vote in my life, although I've always voted. But it's always absolutely certain who is going to get in the constituents that I've been in.
I'm assuming you are, though, a firm advocate of liberal democracy. It's
of course,
I think it's level 5 in your hierarchy.
But, yes, but I think that we should, as a kind of minimal requirement, we should have a democracy that gives everyone a vote that is meaningful, and not a voting system that makes most people who vote into a meaningless ritual, which is what we have at present. And how extraordinary. You see the massive lack of the most minimal of political education about what the real issues are. We need a change in our electoral system, so we have some version of proportional representation. Sort of absolutely obvious. Most countries in Europe have that because they're saner than us. We're encumbered, like so many aspects of life, with mere dogma, mere habit from the past. Even though it's quite obviously against all our interests to do it. It means that and of course, why is it like that? Because the two main parties wants to keep the situation precisely as it is. They don't want any other parties coming up and threatening their ability to have power for their 5 years.
But those two main parties are deeply in tune. Well, as far as they want your votes, they're deeply in tune to the people inside the country. And is that not enough? I mean, you talk a lot about institutions and the need to, get the right institutions and the right aims within them. But these institutions are simply compositions of us. And at some point, it will be us making those decisions. And I can preempt your answer here, actually, in a way, as I was speaking there. I'm assuming you're thinking, or going to say, and please correct me, that that all could be right again, but we haven't paid enough attention to the questions that matter in the beginning as well. It was not enough there's not enough of a civil society talking about the right values, or at least what the right values could be, even if we don't agree on what they are.
Well, one of the things that amazed me is that our present government has been in power for quite some time,
mm-hmm.
and has this sort of mad idea, sort of utter corruption of the idea that sort of crude idea that always free enterprise is best. And so anything that doesn't run on that line must be obliterated, because it is a kind of living refutation of the basic idea. Governments should intervene as less as possible and let free enterprise flourish. And that's brought us to the present state we're in, basically, with a few other idiocies like Brexit to help along the way. But I would really like to go back to the basic argument, because we got to a certain point and then we got distracted by details in the sense like, how are we going to have world government and things like that? Should we even think about it? Because I've pointed out what's fundamentally wrong with, say, Popper's view of science, and what's wrong with the orthodox view of science, that everything in the end rests on evidence. No, there is this very substantial item that the universe is in some way or other physically comprehensible. There is a unified pattern of physical law running through all phenomena. And that's what, and theoretical physics is trying to discover what that is, essentially, that dominates everything that happens, including everything we do. So it's a very terrifying, it has, it may be very interesting. That's what Einstein wanted to discover, and he was personally convinced it exists, although he didn't think, or he wavered on the subject right at the end of his life as to whether science holds it to be a part of scientific knowledge. It is a part of our current scientific knowledge, and it's, of course, metaphysics. And I told you about some other developments of ways in which the idea that the aim of science is truth needs to be enlarged to include values and the uses of science, the value of science. So, and also pure science needs to be made available to people as well. The ultimate aim of science, from the pure point of view, science pursued for its own sake, is to help people everywhere to improve their own understanding of the world in which they live, and to think about it and explore and engage in thinking about what kind of world. Everyone should do a bit of that all the time, as young kids do, of course, but then give up as they grow up and get crushed by the educational system. So then I did the next step, which is my version of Popper's transition from the methodology of science to, if you like, the methodology of life, to generalize what I've been talking about, Aim-Oriented Empiricism, the profoundly problematic character of the basic aim of science, and the need to persistently seek to improve the aim as an integral part of science itself. Well, it isn't just in science that aims are problematic, but in life too, aims are profoundly problematic. And the more rationally, so if we, for obvious reasons, I mean, aims clash. We may completely be unaware that the aim we have that if we seek to pursue it, we'll also seek other things. We'll achieve other things that turn out to be deeply against our interests. We'll have all sorts of undesirable, unforeseen consequences. Or we're trying to achieve that which is impossible to achieve. We may think it's easy, and it turns out to be incredibly difficult. So we need to take very, very seriously that in all sorts of contexts, whether it's personal action, family action, say family life, or local community life, or our country, or institutions, every kind of institution or social endeavor, and in a kind of way, the whole world, and that the whole world is in certain sense, wherever we may be, there is a sort of idea floating around that we hope that gradually things will get better, although at the moment, certainly things are going to get horribly much worse soon, as we are all well aware of, or should be. So authentic rationality must involve sustained exploration of aims, above all when they're problematic, as they often will be in all sorts of contexts. We need to do in life something of what I'm arguing science does, a sort of generalizations of that. Namely, we need to, if we're really serious, for example, if we're trying to take the aim of creating a global civilization, a good world, then we need to represent that aim in the form of a hierarchy of aims, of ideas about what an achievable, long-term achievable civilized world might be, taking into account, all the constraints on what is achievable, and realizing that if we struggle for one thing that we deem to be desirable, like equality, which we might take very seriously, and we should take very seriously, if we take it too seriously, we will crush out individual liberty, and will even crush out equality, because we'll need one lot of special people to impose the equality on the rest, which is sort of what the Soviet Union practiced. If you were a member of the party, you were especially privileged, and you ensured that everyone else was, in quotation marks, equal. So the ideals, what we're aiming for, the different things we're aiming for, and hold to be desirable and of value, clash in all sorts of ways. And in any case, as you've already pointed out, we don't know what's going to happen, so there are uncertainties there, and there are things we don't know, and there are uncertainties there. So there are all sorts of reasons. It's absolutely essential that we practice what I call aim-oriented rationality. We make a vital part of reason, and I mean, reason, that it's essential to have strategies, methods, which help us to improve our aims, which involves, the sort of things I've mentioned, but as a bare minimum, explore possibilities, look critically at what we are achieving, try and get clearer, and not just assume that what we think we're pursuing is what we're pursuing. If we think of an institution, there is what it thinks it's doing, what it says it's doing, what it tries to convince the public it's doing, what it thinks it ought to be doing, and what it actually ought to be doing. And those are all very likely to be different. And, one thing that philosophy ought to be doing is taking very seriously the task of getting clearer about the philosophy of all sorts of institutions, that is, the aims and methods of institutions, not just that of science, because the philosophy of science, important part of philosophy of science is trying to get clear about what the aims and methods of science are, a problem, incidentally, that I think we've more or less solved. But unfortunately, I've failed not just to get scientists to pay attention to this, but philosophers of science as well, completely ignores my work. Anyway, we need to do that for all sorts of other institutions as well, and get that going in social life, so that that every institution has associated with it in one way or another that this vital enterprise of scrutinizing those various kinds of aims and methods in the attempt to get good aims and good methods implemented, better ones than the ones that are. So gradually improving our institutions as we proceed. Difficult, because institutions need a kind of resistance to change. That's the whole point of having an institution. So it's always going to be inevitably a battle of one kind or another. Difficult to do anyway. But we haven't even got the idea of it. Rationality isn't conceived of in these terms.
Why?
Now,
go.
Yes.
Please.
Sorry?
No, please continue.
Yeah. So if we're going to have a conception of reason that makes absolutely crucial that we have methods to improve aims of the kind I've indicated, And there's a very simple argument that any conception of reason which doesn't include these methods can't conceivably be rational, because it's obvious that in all sorts of circumstances we're going to be pursuing aims that are very far from those that are our best, which means that reason will be pursuing an aim that is bad for us and failing to recognize what changes we need to be made to improve, to be at least seeking what is a somewhat more in our real interest. Now, any conception of reason which can be shown to be that will persistently, in all sorts of circumstances, lead us astray, can't be an adequate conception of reason if you take the basic idea to be very general strategies, methods, or rules which in all sorts of circumstances give us our best help with achieving what we want to achieve, or solving the problems we're trying to solve in a good way, whatever we may be doing. So we know that all current conceptions of reason, as far as I know, that sort of are around, are profoundly inadequate. Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, where he expounded ideas about defended approaching things rationally, didn't even have a glimmering of what I've just said anywhere in the entire book. It's simply, if you look at ideas of reason in various places, you will never, apart from my work, I think you will never find anything remotely like Aim-Oriented Empiricism, as far as I've been able to discover. And admittedly, I haven't exactly given a very thorough survey of the field, but I have looked in all sorts of obvious places.
I want to ask you a hard psychological one.
So what this means is, to just finish this very quickly, it's essential that we, as an integral part of reason, that we attend to values, feelings, and desires, because what we want to discover what is desirable and what is good, and we can only hope to discover this by attending to such things as values, feelings, and desires. But of course, not everything, and the obvious thing to say is not everything that feels good is good, and not everything we desire is desirable. So for rationality, we need an interplay of sort of conventional rationality considerations that have to do with fact and logic and so on, with emotional things and subjective things like values, or what may be regarded as that, and values. What we need is an interplay. A point I made in my first book, I put it like this: we need to put the mind in touch with the heart, so that we develop mindful hearts and heartfelt minds. And we need to do that, or something like that, in all contexts. So we need a profound transformation of our ideas of rationality, which, and as I make clear From Knowledge to Wisdom, and I've tried to make clear in other books and publications as well, that the conception of reason that I'm really arguing for, the new conception, which I think is realizing this general idea of general strategies, would give us our best hope of solving our problems and achieving what we really want to achieve, is a kind of synthesis of what one might call traditional rationalism and traditional romanticism, but a vast improvement on both. It sort of solves the problem. It's T.P. Snow, two cultures that Snow never solved, and produces something profoundly new, which, if took seriously, would transform a whole dimension of our culture, just an incidental aspect of what we should really mean by reason, and the conception of reason that universities themselves should take as absolutely basic. The whole of university, everything in it, and the whole structure of the university as a whole should be based on this methodological idea, should implement it in everything that goes on. And also, the basic task of the university, a basic task at any rate, should be to try to get this taken seriously and implemented in every feasible, possible social part of life. It should be sort of an instinctive part of social life.
Why do you think they haven't? Why do you? But that was the question I was running through as you're saying those things. This lag behind.
Well, if you start thinking about aims, especially long-term aims, you have to. There are all sorts of painful and difficult aspects of this, and it's partly just at a certain level, our culture just seems to stop thinking. But it's also painful. You know, it brings you face to face with death, with old age and death. That which I am now face to face with, more or less. But I was far more terrified when I was 5 or 6 than I am now.
But thinking about those things can also help you with those things, right?
And funnily enough, and I say this also somewhere, I think in From Knowledge to Wisdom, but it's exactly when we begin to suspect that what we're striving to achieve, what we've poured so much of our life into trying to achieve, actually the whole thing is a complete waste of time because it's hopeless. No one is ever going to achieve this that we've been struggling to achieve. It's precisely when we begin sort of somewhere, in our being, we suspect that the whole thing is an awful misconception. We should never taken on this enterprise in the first place, or our enterprise shouldn't have attempted it, or our country should never have attempted it. That we cling on to it all the more dogmatically because it seems to threaten our very existence. People identify with what we're trying to achieve and find it very difficult to abandon. Not everyone, but there are people, institutions, endeavors that do it, and it becomes, I think, a sort of feature. I mean, you could ask, why does it happen in science? Why is the scientific community so blind to my simple argument? I mean, what do you think?
One
obvious thing. Yes, sorry.
No, please go.
Well, I was just going to say one obvious thing is that once you've got standard empiricism into place, which excludes officially untestable ideas from science. This is what Popper advocates, more or less. It's very difficult to get into play an argument which has nothing to do with, isn't remotely in itself testable. It's all about how we should proceed, and is our present ideas about how to proceed adequate. As I spelled out I spell it out actually in a book called In Praise of Natural Philosophy, which is devoted to arguing that we need to bring into existence a kind of science that was a development of what, above all, Kepler and Galileo were doing, and is what Newton did in the first edition of the Principia. But he was criticized because he made absolutely clear in the first edition that the whole work was, especially the work on the solar system, was based on 9 hypotheses, labeled clearly hypotheses, and he was criticized for this, and he couldn't stand criticism. So he reformulated the whole of the Principia for the second and third edition, and those are the ones that everyone got to know, which was a sort of crude inductivism, actually not so crude inductivism, because of the great reputation of the great achievement of Newton, he's out of Newton's neurosis, essentially. He inflicted neurosis on subsequent science right down till today. That's the historical account of it. And it's never been rethought. And in a certain sense, that view is being a bit modified. I mean, Popper is a slight modification. We don't verify by induction. We can't. But nevertheless, it's evidence that ultimately decides everything.
Might I offer you a thought on the
Mm.
adoption of it. I can't speak to how the theory is adopted out there, your theory is adopted out there, but I know Popper had a very similar lament. And I mean, as you were speaking there, you bundled Popper in with the mainstream in a way, but he always considered he wasn't in the mainstream. And
of course.
And reading the works of Agassiz and people like this, he spent a lot of time lamenting that people just weren't listening to him. In fact, Objective Knowledge, his one of that book begins with a lament saying, "I solved the problem of induction." Yeah, so
I always think that is absurd, because from my point of view, the amount of attention that Popper's work got is, you think that was absolutely amazing.
I think that's
more attention than I did.
I think that's the point, though. He was knighted, and he still felt that he hadn't been. Yeah. I think it's a psychological phenomenon when we accept things quietly and we criticize them loudly. So if someone does accept aim-oriented empiricism out there and starts working in the lab with it, you're unlikely to ever hear about it. You're just likely to see successful theories.
I mean, I'm at the moment in a very frustrating position, because I know that there are lots of people aware in academia and out of academia that are well aware that climate science in particular, science more generally, and academia has failed humanity in not taking more seriously the need. Well, they see it as getting across the message, but it's much more than that, of course. They're beginning to sort of peck away at what I see as, the first bits and pieces that one tries to do to move towards what we really need, which is what I call wisdom inquiry. I'm not the slightest bit interested in wisdom. What I'm really interested in is wisdom inquiry, a conception of inquiry. So the crucial point that I want to make is that I got to my version of Popper's second step, namely the implication of generalizing, for Popper, the implication of generalizing his inadequate, as I have discovered, inadequate conception, scientific method, to a general conception of rationality, and then spelling out all the amazing implications that this has for a whole range of different things, from how we think about politics and our history, and also what kind of society we should try to develop, and how we should set about solving our problems, to how we should do philosophy, and all sorts of implications for all sorts of other things like music and a whole range, education, and endlessly many different things. And I think that aim-oriented rationality, my generalization of, well, I've already indicated a profound implication, namely, it synthesizes traditional rationalism and romanticism, and transforms them and vastly improves on both. But of course, the big immediate and obvious implication is that if we take that seriously, then we should surely take very seriously that the basic task of social inquiry, I mean, who is going to do this fundamental task of promoting aim-oriented rationality into social life in all sorts of contexts? Well, obviously, social inquiry. So social inquiry should fundamentally be social methodology, namely getting the enterprise of trying to get aim-oriented rationality an integral part, a sort of instinctive part of social life. So all of the social sciences are fundamentally misconceived. They are not sciences. They're not concerned with the pursuit of knowledge fundamentally. They are social methodologies, the methodology of social life. And of course, they are also concerned with improving aspects of knowledge about aspects of society that have to do with getting clearer about what our problems are, and getting clearer about how adequate or inadequate various proposals are for action. But those are all related to, immediately emerge out of, and feed back into the central concern, which is about how to solve social problems. what to do, what needs to be done, what actions need to be taken, what policies need to be adopted, what policies the government needs to adopt in order to solve the problems in the way that will be of value to as many people as possible, to all of us, insofar as that is possible. So social inquiry and so the academic enterprise, of course, needs to be deeply and obviously and basically political, advising the government as to what to do. And one of my structural changes is that we need to, every university or every university system of any country needs to have a sort of virtual government which is exploring the sorts of problems and the sorts of policy options that the actual government ought to be doing, publicizing it, making these deliberations as public as possible, getting the public interest in this thinking that's going on by the sort of university virtual government, as it were, and also telling the government about it, and learning from the discrepancies between what it is thinking about needs to be done, free of all the constraints, inevitable and deeply and deeply bad and immoral, and all to do with self-interest and things like that. What the differences are in an attempt to try to get governments to think along similar lines. That ought to be a basic thing, and also, of course, the whole global system of universities needs to create a virtual democratic, imitating what a democratic global government will be thinking about, and get that thinking publicized and get people thinking about the deliberations it's engaged with as a, with a kind of first tiny minimal step towards the ultimate goal of creating a democratic global government. And they ought to also be thinking about what the steps should be, how one should go about it. What route is the most, what are the possible routes, and what are their relative likelihoods, guesses about which might be the most successful, all of which, of course, is conjectural for all sorts of reasons. But it's the sort of thinking we should be engaged in now. The universities should be doing, getting going, not just in universities, but what really matters, the thinking going on in life. The whole attitude in universities should be what really matters is the thinking going on in life. And we are there to promote that, to sustain it, and help it to be conducted along more fruitful lines. That's a big part of the fundamental task of the university. And I think very few people in universities really think that that's what universities are all about, or should be about. But that's what they really should be about.
I must ask you. I must ask. Yeah, I must ask you a last question, Nick. Just because I'm fully aware. I said we'd speak for an hour, and it's pushing 2 hours, and I've been But I must ask you a last question, which I've had in mind for a while. There, the way you speak and the way you've written about this over the years. I know you've mentioned a few times a kind of soft lament that not enough people have been taken up the theory, or at least you haven't seen enough people taken up your theory. But Popper had this line, I'm sure you're aware of, that it is a wonderful thing in life to discover a problem and then fall in love with that problem, and then discover all the subcategories, sub-problems within it. How do you personally look back on like, as you said, 50 years on tackling this problem? Because it certainly seems though you have fallen in love with the problem, you have enjoyed the process, even if you may have some laments about how it's been taken up in the broader field.
Well, it varies, because sometimes I feel, I'm weary of it. I feel like, I'm sort of repeating myself. What I'm trying to do is keep it there. I'm trying to get it through. I'm trying to get it taken seriously. I'm trying to get a bit of discussion going in universities about the issue. I'm quite modest in my aims. That's all I'm trying to do. And I think I've basically failed. And I feel I have to keep going at it. And I can't literally keep saying the same things again and again. So I find new ways of saying things. And as there are certainly all sorts of different things I can say, and I do say. And sometimes I really enjoy our fundamental problem, which was published a year or two ago, was a sheer joy to write. It was almost like a kind of a holiday from. Sorry about that. I don't know what to do about it. So it varies. I enjoyed enormously writing in praise of natural philosophy. Other things, how can universities best help us create a wiser world, was more a kind of duty obligation, attempt to spell out the message simply. A lot of papers I've written, some of them, it's changed. After I published From Knowledge to Wisdom, and it met with, from my terms, great success. Nothing happened for some months, and then I was told someone at UCL got up when I went into the place where we have coffee. Someone I hardly knew, a professor, and said, "I've just read the best review of a book that I've ever read in my life in Nature. Your book that I gather has been published." So I gulped down my coffee, rushed to the library, read it, and it was absolutely glowing review. Well, that's a good start, to have your first review, a glowing review. It really was a good review. It really understood what the book was about and praised it. And Christopher Longret Higgins was a much respected person who'd initially been in theoretical chemistry and then became an artificial intelligence person. He's now died long ago. And then it got reviewed all over the place. Philosophers mostly were idiotic. They accused me of defending things that I'd explicitly rejected in my book, and stupidities like that. The only philosopher who I can think of who wrote a glowing review was Mary Midgley. And Anthony O'Hare's account later in his book was absolutely ridiculous. He lumped me with someone who was arguing for a feminist stance, as sort of someone who's thought that science should be abandon rationality. When what I was arguing exactly opposite, it should start being genuinely rational. So for about 20 years, I thought, well, I get good. I can turn my attention to other things, to related but different things. And one of the things I was interested in was getting a decent version of quantum theory, because obviously orthodox quantum theory, from my perspective, is hopeless, because it's one of these horribly ad hoc theories in which it's a mixture of quantum postulates and postulates about the measuring process, namely some part of classical physics that is incompatible with quantum theory. What you need is a theory that's solely about the quantum domain, but of course has implications for measurements, for evidence. So I worked hard at that problem for the next 10 to 20 years and arrived at a solution that was finally published in Physics Letters. And for a long time was ignored, but there were one or two other people who were sort of thinking along the same lines, which didn't take seriously this basic idea that we can solve the big mysteries of quantum theory, namely the wave particle theory, if we take seriously that the fundamental domain, the way these things interact, the way quantum entities interact with each other, is fundamentally probabilistic. So I was sort of passionately in love with that, true, and so it's distantly related to my main work, but only sort of rather marginally.
Mm-hmm.
And then I became aware my book had fallen out of print. My idea was sort of being forgotten about. And I thought I better get back to it and start doing the other things that I need to do in connection with it, because that's far more important. And so it's been a mixture of despair and tedium and sort of, wonderful.
Well,
And also being at where I was at UCL, I started up a seminar which was devoted to exploring problems that cut across all disciplinary boundaries. It's what I was beginning to do, what I think every university should do, namely keep alive, sustained thinking about our fundamental problem, which I take to be how can the world we live in, the world we ordinarily construe it to be, how can this exist and best flourish as an integral part of the physical universe, which I take to be to include all our other problems, both intellectual problems and practical problems of living. And no university that doesn't keep alive, sustained thinking about that in the most elementary terms is fundamentally irrational. And I know of no university that is structured so as to incorporate that sort of as an absolutely standard part of what universities are about. It's essentially the betrayal of philosophy, the utter appalling state of philosophy, which has become a mere, discipline amongst others, which it's not how philosophy should be pursued at all. The basic task of philosophy is to get everyone to think about our philosophical problems, namely our fundamental problems, just every now and again, a bit, to at least be aware of what they are, and that they're still deeply, profoundly puzzling, and with lots of different answers that people give very different answers to, and therefore we should, not be dogmatically committed without even thinking about it to one or other in the way we think about everything else and everything that we do, which is what all Popper would agree, incidentally, with everything that I'm saying at this point.
Mm.
And I not only is that book, Our Fundamental Problem, which I wrote with great delight, and it's got published a year or two ago, but I recently got in touch with our provost of our university, who's sort of fairly new to the job, and he was very enthusiastic about bringing to life a symposium which meets regularly, and everyone at the university is invited to, that is devoted to exploring that problem and how it, in fruitful ways interacts with all other problems and all other disciplines in both directions, of course. But I couldn't get anyone else so far, apart from a few individuals, to have any interest in it.
Well,
so a very paradoxical situation.
I should offer you this, that after I do my podcast with guests, I often send them an email. You'll get one too, Nick, after this podcast. And I often ask if there's anyone out there in the field who I should be speaking to. And I always say, who I should be speaking to. And I often say, and if they're a critic of Popper, all the better, right? I want to see how his theories stand up or don't stand up. And this is number 28 in the series. And I must have had at least 5 or 6 guests reply and say, have you spoken to Nick Maxwell yet? So I can promise you that you are being read, and it is going around a lot. I think often it happens quietly, and it's just not as seen as it should be. But I think that is also a good place to leave the podcast on.
Can I just say one thing about Popper is the time? I mean, Popper had a big impact on physicists and physics in fairly recent times. So he penetrated through to the physics community, less so to other areas of science. I certainly know of big shots in the physics world who take Popper very seriously and say they were influenced by Popper in their actual key scientific work that they did. But I think now a rather strange situation has developed, that Popper is a sort of small coterie of people who know about Popper, but he's kind of hasn't got much influence in philosophy of science, sort of mainstream philosophy of science. I mean, people know about his work, but more or less kind of ignore it a lot. And in other areas, I feel, I keep encountering people who sort of, maybe they've heard that Popper exists, but they don't know much about his work. I've just got to know a bloke at UCL who's engaged in what I regard as absolutely the fundamental problem, namely a fundamental problem, namely global governance, as it's called. But he's, regarded by UCL as a kind of struggling, marginal, funny department and funny position, struggling with problems of funds and so on, rather than a central task, central part of what the whole university should be concerned with. So, and he'd barely heard, well, he knows, I think, possibly Popper, but he's never read anything by Popper. It's not inside his intellectual framework at all. And I think that's very general. And specialization has got, as you must be aware, has got worse and worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
The second chapter,
yes.
From Knowledge to Wisdom, was going to be all against specialization and the vital need to keep thinking about fundamental problems. And then it got too long, so I published it was called Science, Reason, Knowledge and Wisdom, a critique of specialism, a very long paper, which was published in 1980, which is a very early exposition of a big part of what I've been arguing for, including an incidental critique.
Well, we must do this again, Nick, sometime soon.
Well, I feel I gave a very kind of ragged account of my work. We plunged all over the place. It wasn't
well, just like our first interview. I feel at the end I could have asked so many more questions, So, it would be great to chat again soon about these topics. And like I say, I always learn an awful lot from reading your work and from speaking with you. So hugely enjoyable from my behalf. And I must say,
it wasn't a terrible obligation.
No, never. And I must say,
you never came across philosophy seminars for 5-year-olds, did you? So do have a look at that if you are not absolutely stick to the teeth of my work, because it's something I wrote long ago in '86. I got this sort of explanation when it finally got published 20 years later. But it's a very gentle account, which sort of is really the whole thing in a 7 or 9 page short article.
Well, I can promise you two things.
A very gentle read. But I just reread it because I wanted to send it to someone. I wanted to check what I'd said all those years ago. And it gives a sort of different way of putting the whole thing.
Well, I can promise you that I will read it, and I will also link it below. And I'll link it below as well for the listeners to read.
There's no problem about getting young kids to do what I'm on about. The problem is 55-year-old professors.
Well,
they're going to find they're almost immune to the learning that's needed. But kids will have, 5-year-olds will have no problem whatsoever, properly taught, properly encouraged to do what they do anyway. What all kids have to do, think of the amazing things that a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old has done without any form of education whatsoever in the first 4 years of life.
Well, that is something you do have in common with Popper there. He was always fascinated by the ability of children to learn, and always, tortured by watching adults and how they struggle with it and don't enjoy it. But I fear it's another avenue to run down here. I will link below the podcast, Nick, your books, and you have a couple of websites as well out there. I will link the previous podcast, and I will link that article as well. And like I said, we must chat again soon. It's been such a pleasure. It always is, Nick. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's been a real pleasure for me, except I feel I haven't done the occasion justice. I do apologize for sort of giving such a scattered, incoherent exposition of what my life has been all about for so long, or a part of it, a big part of it.
No, not at all.
A bigger part, but I certainly have poured a lot of energy into it and effort. But also, it's had good things too, as you remarked. So thank you very, very much for making it possible. I've enjoyed it too.